Alright class, welcome back. I hope this is working out. Again, let me know in the comments what you think, and let me know what you think of the background music. I don't know, just trying things out. In this lecture, we'll be talking about another one of those big, huge subjects that profoundly shaped the world, not only from its time, but it shapes our time as well. The Industrial Revolution is what the textbook labels as, quote, the most profound transformation in human life since the beginnings of agriculture. Indeed, the Industrial Revolution produced incredible changes in technology, the environment, economics, society, and the relationship between those nations that industrialized and those that didn't. Now we have to step back for a second and think about how we talk about the Industrial Revolution. We used to define the world as industrialized and then pre-industrial, as in industrialized nations. Now that the US is mostly post-industrial, that's kind of fallen out of fashion. What our book chapter does is focus a lot around England. It's an easy narrative to make that the Industrial Revolution began in England but had worldwide effects. This is just one more example of the Western bias in the textbook. And I think we've talked in our class about how the periodization for our course is based on a Western timeline, right? Columbus, explorers, things like that. The Industrial Revolution works in sort of the same way. Now, we can't change the fact that England did industrialize before most other countries, but there's some complex reasons for the causes of 1, the Industrial Revolution, and 2, why England gets so much attention. Now, before we go in much further, I want to provide sort of a roadmap for where we hope to go today. In parts 1 and 2, we'll define and talk about the origins or causes of the Industrial Revolution. Part 3, we'll look at the technological aspect, kind of the meat of the Industrial Revolution, so to speak. In the final segment, Part 4, we'll examine the impact of the early Industrial Revolution on Europe and the world and talk about new economic and social ideas, and also we'll talk about the limits of industrialization outside of Western nations. As a general theme, there will be some great things that come about, and some horrible ones. And I'd like to kind of direct your attention to a quote from the textbook on page 471. This is recounting a kind of a vignette from Friedrich Engels, who was a critic of capitalism but was also a factory owner. He recounted a meeting with a well-to-do citizen in England. Engels recalled, "One day I walked with one of these middle-class gentlemen into Manchester. I spoke to him about the disgraceful and unhealthy slums and drew his attention to the disgusting condition of that part of the town in which the factory workers lived. I declared that I had never seen so badly built a town in my life. He listened patiently, and at the corner of the street at which we parted company, he remarked, 'And yet there is a great deal of money made here. Good morning, sir.'" Right? In all of these situations, whether it's the Industrial Revolution or exploration, there are a lot of things that we tend to look past. And I would invite you to not look past those things. Since this is one of those big historian terms, we'll go ahead and define it using the textbook's definition. Now you can copy this down, but you should be able to put it into your own words for the exam. And if you ask me, and you didn't, this is actually pretty horrible wording, but here we go. The Industrial Revolution was the transformation of the economy, the environment, and living conditions, occurring first in England in the 18th century, that resulted from the use of steam engines, the mechanization of manufacturing and factories, and innovation in transportation and communication. The authors of the text identify 4 main causes of the Industrial Revolution: population growth, the British Agricultural Revolution, the expansion of trade, and an overall openness to innovation. Now, those don't mean much on their own, so we'll take each one step by step. Also, I want to note there's an underline under the S under causes. Whenever you're talking about a huge thing like the Industrial Revolution, there's almost never one single cause. Now, historians might debate over which cause was the most relevant or had the biggest effect, or how this cause tells us more than that cause, but rarely is there ever just one cause for any historically significant event like this. Population growth fueled the Industrial Revolution by increasing consumer demand and lowering labor costs. Think about it. When you've got more people around, especially women and children, as a factory owner, you can pay them less money. In this world of the Industrial Revolution, women and children don't produce the same output and can be just as exploited, and often more so than men. Between 1650 and 1850, Europe's population grew from 100 million to 266 million, and the number of city dwellers more than doubled. London grew from 740,000 in 1760 to 3.2 million people by 1860. That's just 100 years, and look at that population growth. Part of this can be explained due to a better resistance to diseases. By the 1840s, children born in London were 3 times less likely to die in childhood than those born in the 1730s. Perhaps more importantly, though, was the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution, as the textbook defines, was, quote, the transformation of farming that resulted in the 18th century from the spread of new crops, improvements in cultivation techniques and livestock breeding, and the consolidation of small holdings into large farms, from which tenants and sharecroppers were forcibly expelled, end quote. The agricultural revolution provided food for city dwellers, but forced poorer peasants off the land. We already talked about some of the new crops coming to the Old World, but potatoes and corn were probably the most important. Potatoes yielded 2 to 3 times more calories per acre than grains did. More calories mean more energy to work, and boy, they're going to need it in the factories. Prosperous landowners tried new methods and new crops, draining marshes to improve the soil, breeding better livestock whose manure was used to improve fertilizer, and introducing crop rotation. Some landowners enclosed their land, meaning they consolidated their holdings, including the common grazing grounds that had been previously open to everyone. The enclosure movement turned the rural poor into tenants and turned sharecroppers into landless farm laborers. Most of these farm laborers ended up moving to cities to seek work or took their chances in the United States, Canada, or heaven help them, Australia. Everything there can kill you except like the koala bears. Expanding domestic and foreign demand for textiles also led to innovation in Europe. Traditionally, European textiles were produced by skilled artisans. A system called Proto Industrialization replaced expensive artisans. Artisans generally earned daily wages. Proto-industrial workers were paid based on what they produced. This was also a cheap form of labor savings from a factory owner point of view. Send the materials to farm families in the rural countryside and break down the steps of manufacture into easily digestible and mastered steps. So I want to take a second here to talk about proto-industrialization and what that means. Imagine you've got 2 people. You've got an artisan, a tailor maybe, who makes a suit. He makes all parts of it, from the jacket to the trousers, sews the buttons on himself, makes the collars, the pockets, whatever is involved in making a suit. Proto-industrialization takes that suit-making model and breaks it down. So you send out the sleeves to one group of people. You send out the trousers to one group of people. You send out, I don't know, maybe one person finishes with the buttons. Breaking down the steps, kind of a division of labor. Nations also provided governmental support for industrialization and trade. The biggest things that governments did was to sponsor improvements in road networks and support the construction of canals. Now, there's a great example of this right here in the United States. The Erie Canal in upstate New York connected Buffalo and western New York to the Atlantic Ocean trade and was paid for in large part by the state of New York. The construction and maintenance of navies helped to protect trade on the seas from pirates and smugglers. Governments supported innovative ideas by offering patents to inventors to protect their intellectual property. And by the way, if this medical stuff doesn't work out for you guys, if you're interested in becoming a lawyer someday, there is a lot of intellectual property laws issues out there, and you could make bank from the Silicon Valley people. European governments and eventually the United States sent expeditions around the world to collect plants that could be profitably grown in their colonies. Carl Linnaeus, the father of the classification system for flora and fauna, tried so hard to get tea plants from China that could grow in a greenhouse, but he was always unsuccessful. Industry and governments working together made the Industrial Revolution boom. Trade also stimulated a growing interest and innovation among educated people throughout Europe and the Americas, as well as a much deeper engagement of colonial possessions with foreign markets. Nearly all the European powers profited from plantation colonies in the Americas. But there was also a dramatic expansion of European commerce, with markets in Africa and Asia, including the buying and selling of human beings and dangerously addictive drugs, and we'll have more on that later. Europeans consumed ever-growing quantities of sugar to sweeten their tea, coffee, cocoa, pastries, and candies, and the demand for manufactures like porcelain cups or dinnerware increased as well. At the same time, Caribbean planters imported a steeply rising volume of cotton textiles to clothe themselves and the people they claimed ownership over. Initially, these cotton textiles were imported from Asia, but increasing demand led to the creation of the domestic cotton textile industries, the first truly modern mechanized industry. Now, if you remember nothing else from this lecture, it should be that enslaved African laborers, exploited Chinese farmers, and poor men, women, and children provided the labor for the three biggest trade goods of the Industrial Revolution: sugar, tea, and cotton cloth. Now, you might be wondering, why does the Industrial Revolution start in England? Well, we've talked about some of the causes: growing population, the agricultural revolution, innovation, and trade expansion. Well, Britain had the largest city in the world and was the fastest growing population in the world. It was able to feed more people than ever thanks to the agricultural revolution increase in productivity, and the British had supplanted the Dutch as the #1 traders on the high seas. Britain also has innovation on lockdown. British inventors, aided by the scientific revolution, developed efficient steam engines that replaced wind, water, and animal power as the source of energy for industrial machinery. Britain had a wealth of natural resources, especially coal and iron ore, two key ingredients in the Industrial Revolution. Britain's extensive and developed coastline, rivers, and canals provided a water gateway for trade, and its strong craft tradition trained a large number of skilled mechanics. Its patent system, again, protected the intellectual property rights of inventors. Beyond that, and this might seem surprising, Britain had one of the most fluid societies in Europe, especially in great contrast to France and Russia. The aristocracy wasn't as powerful, and there was some limited class mobility, although still definitely class divisions. But one of the weird things, and this is kind of taking a step back from this, but just to talk about British people and how they're weird. I'm kidding. But one of the weird things about the British accent is that the accent that a person has generally reveals a lot about their class and where they're from. We don't always get this in the United States, right? Because not everybody who sounds like a hillbilly is an idiot, although that's a great, easy shorthand to make if you're in Hollywood. Anyway, there's this serial killer in England some years back, and he basically called into a radio show and taunted the police, like, "Ooh, come get me." And after the police consulted a team of linguistics people, they were able to narrow down their search to just like a few square miles around him, and they caught the guy. So don't call don't call radio shows if you're a serial killer. In England, anyway. I don't know. Well, just don't be a serial killer. That's really the short answer for that. Anyway, there's fluidity among classes, but people really aren't moving around too much. Finally, Britain also had a strong tradition of a commercial culture. Strong banks, joint stock companies, a stock market, commercial insurance, these are all part of that commercial culture. And you might recall it was a joint stock company called the Virginia Company that was really successful after the curing of tobacco that turned it into a cash crop. All right, I'm going to put a pin on this. We'll come back in the second part of the lecture looking more at the technological side, mass production, things like that. So I hope it's working. Stay tuned for the second part of the lecture.